I just want to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to present today is the product of a lot of people involved at UVM, a whole cohort of students who are shown here along the top, who've been involved in my group since 2011 when we first got started on this work, and my collaborators, Don Ross and Mandar DeWolker at UVM, and just a whole other bunch of students that have helped us with fieldwork, GIS work, and so on over the years. And I thought I'd start with a little bit of context when Helen Carr reached out from DEC back in the winter and asked if I would do one of these lunchtime talks. She had asked if I would talk about this relatively recent work that was funded by VTrans. We just wrapped this up last summer, looking at gully erosion below road outfalls. And I asked, could I do something a little bit bigger picture? Because I wanted to back up and think a little bit more broadly than just about this most recent study. And I'd had a conversation with Jim Ryan about that same time and asked him, what do you think people would want to hear about? And he expressed that, bringing the community up to speed on the research might be helpful, but maybe also helpful to help the community think about responding to the Vermont Climate Action Plan and thinking about what we know about roads and erosion and phosphorus production on roads and how that connects to building resilience in our communities and thinking about being responsive to the Climate Action Plan would be useful. And in the context of our changing climate, these are just a couple of graphs out of the recently released Vermont Climate Assessment showing changes over the decades in observed annual precipitation and in these number of heavy precipitation days. We're getting wetter. It's very clear. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, while it was motivated by an interest in improving clean water in the Lake Champlain Basin, I'm going to try and structure it to speak to this imperative of addressing climate change in the state and building resilient communities in the state. So with that in mind, Mary, by the way, if there's someone without a mic muted, you're able to mute them through the participant list. Okay, so with that context in mind, I'm just going to use this little graphic from the Vermont Climate Action Plan as a final piece of context setting. And in my presentation today, I'll show you a roadmap for it in just a minute. I am going to try and gear what I do to come back to this Climate Action Plan and comment near the end of my presentation on how we can take these lessons from my group at UVM, a decade of research on roads and their role in erosion, sediment production, and water quality impacts, and think about how do we take those lessons and move forward to be responsive to the Climate Action Plan. And I think there are some particular connections around vital communities, but I think there's some other connections in here too. And I'd actually really love to hear from some of you out there in the state who are on the lecture today. So here's a roadmap, pun intended, of where I plan to go in this next 25 or so minutes. And I'm going to do this at a pretty high level. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through a lot of research. But I'll start by giving you a sense of some of the earliest work that we did to understand road surface and ditch erosion as a source of sediment and phosphorus production, how we did that work, where we did it, what we found, and how we work to kind of quantify the relative importance of those road contributions to receiving water loads. That work ultimately went into some of the calculations of the Lake Champlain TMDL for sources of pollutants and into some of the targets that we're trying to achieve with water quality improvements to the lake. And I'll also talk kind of briefly about this more recent road outfall erosion work that VTrans funded. And then I'll kind of end the bigger part of my presentation with talking about what we've learned about mitigating road erosion through using best practices and thinking about building resilience to flooding with this work. And that'll comprise 3/4 of what I'll present today. But as I finish that up, I'm also going to kind of turn to something a little bit different and talk about what we know about this work and what it might have to say about building lessons for resilient communities. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to launch into these slides that are kind of question. Just I heard someone turn on a mic. I'm going to launch into these slides that are kind of each slide is sort of a high level overview of some research approaches and findings. And at the end of my presentation, I have links for any of you who are on the call or listening to the recording about technical reports that lay out many more details of these studies. So if any of you are interested, there are pretty thorough written reports on all of this work. So some of the earliest work that we did used erosion inventories, essentially walks down segments of roads. And we did this work in the Winooski River watershed, where we walked 50 road segments, each 2 kilometers long, and essentially mapped erosional and depositional features in the presence of BMPs, just to try and get a sense of the magnitude of the road erosion problem. And in that work, what we found is that road erosional features are quite common. They occur very frequently on the road network, anywhere from typically about 10 to 20 features per kilometer of road length. And they're relatively modest in size. Most of them are less than 10 cubic meters of sediment volume per feature. We also found in this work that these erosional feature frequencies and volumes are pretty well related to road grade. So the steeper the road gradient, the more frequently you see these kinds of features eroding on roads or in the ditches, and the larger their volumes are. And this relationship with road grade gives us the ability then to extrapolate from these sampled segments out into the entire road network. And we did that in this first piece of work that the Basin Program funded for the Winooski River Basin, where we had road length and we had a measure of road gradient. And we used that to look at the distribution of the unpaved road network and our estimate of the percentage of sediment eroded from roads. And so this graph normalizes both the road length and the sediment produced to 100%. And what you can see from this is that there are some parts of the Winooski River Basin that comprise a pretty good share of the road network, but contribute a fairly modest percentage of the sediment eroded from roads by our estimates. But there are other parts of the basin, the Little River and the Mad River, that comprise a fairly small fraction, 25% of the road network length, but contribute a much larger fraction, more than 50% of the sediment eroded from roads. And these are estimated. Estimates, but important sort of to point out where we might sort of target our attention, because there are these hot spots, typically in the steepest parts of the basins, where this road erosion problem really emerges. In addition to that kind of inventorying type work that we did with support from the Basin Program, that was work that was launched in 2011, wrapped up in about 2013. We also did a series of work monitoring during storm events and instrumenting a set of road segments. We installed these little weirs on culvert inlets, put pressure transducers in front of them so we could measure water level, created what we call in hydrology a rating curve so we could turn that water level into a discharge. And we did this work in the Mad River Valley because the Friends of the Mad River have this Mad River Watch water quality monitoring program. So we were able to use their data from these small catchments to estimate how much water, how much sediment, how much phosphorus comes out of these catchments in a year. And then we were able to use our measurements on roads to get a sense of, on a storm by storm, and then scaling up to an annual basis, what's coming off of the roads. So we set up this instrumentation on a set of road segments. You're seeing some of these located on the west side of the Mad River Valley. Here, we had other segments on the east side. We actually had only enough instrumentation to do about half of these at a time, so we moved our instruments around over that 2-year study. And the data that we produced from that looks something like this. So this is for a single storm event in October of 2011. Each of these graphs shows discharge on this y-axis and suspended sediment concentration on this y-axis. And this is for a set of 5 road segments that we were monitoring at once. And what we saw from this storm-based monitoring is pretty simple or similar across events. Essentially, that as the road segment length gets longer, so this is the shortest road segment, longer, 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 and longest, the magnitude of discharge gets greater. So smaller magnitude, increasingly large magnitude of runoff generated as the road length gets longer. But the sediment picture was a little bit different. The sediment concentrations, and this is a log scale of sediment concentrations. Every time you tick up in one of these numbers, it's an order of magnitude more sediment per liter of water being shed off of these roads. And what we see is that as the road gradient gets steeper, so we're moving to the steepest road segments here, that concentration of sediment really ticked up. So it's a road length story or road area story with runoff production, but a slope steepness or road gradient steepness story when it comes to sediment production and the phosphorus attached to that sediment. So these kinds of storm-based results allowed us to then sort of scale up from individual study sites to the catchments. And again, here's a map of these catchments that we were working in, and the dots are the road segments that we were making the measurements. And these graphs give you a picture of the relative importance of roads versus the catchment yield for suspended sediment and phosphorus. And what we saw from this is that in these 5 places where we're doing this work, roads comprised about somewhere between 10% and up to almost 30% of the sediment that was yielded out of the watersheds or the catchments. And for phosphorus, the road contributions were a little over 10% to more than a third of the catchment contributions or fluxes of phosphorus. So in short, roads based on this work emerge as pretty important source to receiving waters. If these black and blue bars are the receiving waters, roads emerge as a pretty important source of both suspended sediment and phosphorus. And it was these findings, that earlier set of findings on the frequency, the volume of erosional features, and this storm-based analysis of the relative fraction of road contributions to the catchments that kind of led to the numbers that went into the Lake Champlain TMDL for road-related contributions to phosphorus. The more recent work that we've done that was funded by the Vermont Agency of Transportation asked to look out from the road surface itself in the ditches to what was going on at outfalls, and to address this problem that we see all over the place, that when water discharges from a culvert or an outfall, stormwater outfall, that it very often will erode gullies on these steep slopes. And so this work involved both what I'm going to call an intensive assessment, very high level measurements at just a finite number of sites, 13 sites, and also a broader, like more extensive assessment that I'll talk about in a few minutes across a larger portion of the state. So for this part of the work, what we did is selected 13 sites in Chittenden, Washington, and Lamoille County, where we used terrestrial LiDAR scanning, which is just this technology that basically scans the surface and can be used to construct a digital elevation model of the surface. We also sampled the soils in these gully walls to quantify the phosphorus content of the evacuated sediment. And we studied these 13 sites for a period of time, but then we worked with VTrans and some of the municipalities to install what we called treatments or erosion control structures, rock lining, other sorts of things to control erosion. And then we continued to monitor those treated sites relative to the sites that weren't treated or our control sites to kind of get a sense of whether those treatments were effective. This, by the way, happened during the pandemic. We started this project in July of 2019 and did a bunch of work in that fall. And then our follow-up work was due to start in like April of 2020 when no one could go outside. But we did get back outside later that summer and worked that summer and then into the following field season on this work. And here's a summary, kind of one summary of some of the things we found from that work on gully or outlet erosion. This is results from just a single day survey in May, or a single point in time survey in May of these sites, showing how we can predict gully volume as a function of different characteristics of the setting. So road length, road contributing area, and the contributing drainage area upslope of the road all explain the volume of gullies of these 13 sites that we studied. And importantly, the predictive power, which is measured by the statistical metric here, 45% of the variability in volume explained by road length, that predictive power increases as you go to contributing road area and increases even more when you incorporate that upslope contributing area. So this amount of the road that's draining to the outlet is a really important predictor of gully volume. We thought that slope steepness would also be an important predictor, and you can see if I kind of trace my cursor through here, as the slopes at the outfalls get steeper, we do see larger gully volumes. But we had this one site in Colchester that is not very steep, but it's a really long road segment. So it sort of falls off this general trend because it seems to be the road segment length or the contributing area that's contributing to the gully volume. And then we had this other site on I-89 in Middlesex that's super steep, but didn't have very much contributing length. So it didn't fall in this curve either. But in general, the area of the road and that upslope contributing area and the steepness of the outfall are important controls on gully volume in the amount of material, the sediment and the sediment-bound phosphorus that's coming off of those culvert outlets. And then another thing that we learned from this work, by going back and repeatedly surveying these gullies over time, we were able to look at the change or the evolution of these features over about a 1.5 year period of time. And this is only for some of the sites. We used the Burlington Airport weather station to quantify rainfall in the interval between the surveys. But what we saw is that as the amount of rainfall that accumulated between survey dates increased, so too did the change in gully volume. So these things are growing and getting bigger as we have rainfall events at the sites. Also tried to get at the magnitude of this gully problem more extensively, and this emerged as a COVID project when we were all sitting behind our computers and couldn't go outside, because we realized we had these really useful data sets of airborne LIDAR collected across the state and collected at different points of time. Some of the earliest collects were back in 2005, and some of the most recent collects are as recently as 2017, excuse me. So we looked for places where there was overlapping coverage at different points in time so that we could use that LIDAR generated digital elevation models to look for gullies. And we had a whole fleet of students that fall of 2020 who were taking classes remotely. So we got a group of them together and put them on the LIDAR DEMs and basically asked them to look for gully features. This is a culvert line here from the GIS data set, and this is a shaded DEM, and you can see some of these features that we were able to identify. And the group of students inspected almost 10,000 culverts across 35 towns in the state and identified almost 1,000 gullies from this data set. And from this, we selected about a third of those and did sort of volume extraction to try and get a measure of how much volume change there was if you went from one LIDAR source date to the next. And so this yielded a pretty nice large data set across the state of how common this occurrence of gullying is and the size of these things. Here's another map of this. I'm sorry for the lack of a locator here. Here's Lake Champlain, the western shores of Lake Champlain, all the way over to the Northeast Kingdom. And these hatched marks are just parts of the state that we've given a name here, but they really relate to these parts of the state where we have overlapping LIDAR collected at 2 different periods of time. And then the points are those 303 points from which we could estimate a rate of gully change over time. And you can see that the change over time can be quite small for some of these gullies identified and quite large for some of the other gullies identified. And I've also showing here this zone of Tropical Storm Irene's impact across the state, just so that you can see how that overlaps. And so then we asked, well, can we identify what controls this rate of gully evolution or change? And we looked at a whole set of possible explanatory factors, including some of the ones I've hinted at before: road length, slope steepness, road gradient, elevation, maybe as a proxy for precipitation, because we know we get more precip higher up in elevation, characteristics of the soils, parent material, land cover, and exposure to Tropical Storm Irene. And this statistical model that I'm going to show you here is a little complex to interpret, but I'm going to walk you through it. So what we're showing here is of these 303 gullies that we identified and looked at change over time, the what do I want to say? The controls on gully change rates is pretty complex. It's a function of a bunch of these different factors, but in different sorts of ways. So across this diagram, what I'm showing is the mean rate of change here, and the standard deviation of that rate, and the number of gullies that parse out into this. This is a classification tree. And so what you can see if you sort of step back from this a bit is that the gully sizes are quite a bit smaller on more gentle slopes and quite a bit larger in terms of their change over time on the steeper slopes. And on these flatter slopes, the controls include the amount of impervious surface around the outfall. We used a buffer around the outfalls to look at impervious surface and land cover. And this is that soil erodibility factor. So you can see that among these small gullies that have quite a bit of variability in size, the biggest ones were associated with places where you had more impervious cover around the outlet, and more developed land cover around the outlet. And then on these steeper slopes, where the average gully size was quite a bit bigger than on the flatter slopes, the biggest gullies were associated with those that occurred in that area that had been impacted by Tropical Storm Irene. So just a kind of high-level view of how complex the development of these erosional features are across the state as we look through this data set. And then I'll shift gears a little bit now, just checking the time, because this last part of the presentation, before I go to this kind of community implications, focuses on what we've learned through this collection of studies on how effective best management practices are in addressing the kind of erosion and sediment phosphorus production that we see on roads. And so we've done two separate studies on this type of work. The first was funded by Vermont DEC in 2014, 13 and 14, and the more recent one, part of that VTRAN study. And we've used a range of different approaches to get at this BMP effectiveness question. One approach that we used early on was an approach that I'll call an experimental manipulation, similar to what we did more recently with VTRANs, where we set up paired road segments that were kind of similar in gradient and setting. We called one a control site and one a treated site. The treatments included these three different things: stone line ditching, check dams and turnouts, and these compost socks that we tried. This work was all in the Mad River Valley. We did monitoring through a set of storm events on the paired sites and collected the sediment in these silt fences, brought it back to UVM, dried it, weighed it, so on. And then after a period of time, we worked with the road crews in these towns. Sorry, I should have showed this first. During this sort of pre-treatment period, we would excavate the sediment out of these silt fences, as I mentioned, dry it, and then we would compare the control site to the treated site. So each of these points is an individual storm event where we've excavated this material out. And the values that you're seeing on this graph are just the sediment dry mass. So this is intended to just get a sense of how these sites compare to each other. And then after we get enough of a data set to establish this pre-treatment condition, then we worked with the Better Backroads program at the time, and the road crews in these towns in the Mad River Valley where we were doing this work to install a treatment of these three types on these road segments. And then we would continue to monitor through these silt fences and look at what the change was in sediment dry mass and related phosphorus after the treatment was installed. And so those results for the stone line ditch sites look like this. There were 3 sites for each of those 3 treatments. Here's the pre-treatment data of the control versus the treated site for each of these. And then what you can see is that after the treatment, the production out of the treated site relative to the control site really reduced in each case. So we're able to quantify that putting in these practices that the towns are using, the Better Roads program is funding, were highly effective in reducing the production of sediment and the sediment-bound phosphorus from these sites. We also were able to get kind of a ballpark estimate of these treatment costs, because every time there's an application to the Better Roads program, there's an application that includes what it's going to cost in terms of materials and labor and so on. So I'm going to come back to this number a little bit later, but we use the applications for these experimental sites and then other records from Better Roads to get at kind of a ballpark estimate of what this work cost at the town level. And I should say that this was back in 2014, so those dollars would clearly be inflated today. All right, in addition to that experimental work, we also, in this DEC-funded study, did some retrospective assessments. So we went back in time and looked at some sites that Better Back Roads had funded. We went back to 46 sites and evaluated 100 BMPs at these sites. And those BMPs at that time ranged in age from 1 to 8 years old. And we took the records from the applications, the paper files, went out in the field and located the sites. And then at each site, we just did a qualitative assessment. We located the BMP, and then we qualitatively tagged it as either intact, compromised, or failed, depending upon a visual inspection of whether it appeared that the practice, and there were these different kinds of practices, were continuing to function in the way they were designed to address runoff and water quality issues. And I just want to mention here that when we tagged a site as compromised, it didn't mean that the design was not right. It just meant that there was accumulated debris or sediment at the site that would indicate that in order to continue to function as designed, there would need to be some maintenance that would happen. And so here's what the results of that assessment looked like. These graphs are organized by this intact, compromised, and failed condition across these 3 different time periods of age of the BMPs, with a little bit of information about how many BMPs at how many sites. And I think the thing to sort of narrow in on is how few of them had failed in our inspections. In fact, out of the 100 BMPs that we assessed, only 10 of them had outright failed. So when the practices are put in place, these data show that they're highly effective in reaching addressing the design target, and that they stand up over time. It turned out at the time that we had done this work, there were no records in the Better Back Roads program that were older than 8 years old. And we also asked at that time, how do these things stand up to flood exposure? Because we had this report that the Basin Program had released that has maps of historical floods and their impact zones in Vermont. So we laid that impact zone over the data set and just tallied this intact, compromised, or failed here. And what you could see from this is of those 10 that had failed, fewer than those, only about 8 of those were in the flood impact zone. And by and large, of all of those in the flood impact zone, most of them remained intact or just needed some maintenance to continue to provide the functions that they were designed to provide. So I think this was important insights for the user community, that when we put these practices in place, they stand up over time and they stand up under extreme flooding too. And in this most recent project with VTrans, we decided to go back and do some more of this work by not only assessing some additional Better Roads projects, but also some of the newer DEC grant aid projects and some of these direct damage impact report sites that VTrans had compiled. So we did the same kind of retrospective assessment, that same intact, compromised, and failed, visited 149 sites, with 217 different practices in place, used the files of what had been put in place and inspected them and just rated them again for intact, compromised, and failed. And here I'm just showing a range of these different kinds of practices that have been used and color coding them according to this condition assessment. And I do definitely want to stress, compromise doesn't mean a failure. In many cases, things like an armored turnout or a plunge pool, if they're accumulating sediment, we would have called them compromised just because eventually they'll need some maintenance, but they're working. They're clearly doing their job. And what you really should take away from this is that very few of them fail. When we put them in, they appear to work as designed. So that's really good news. Okay, so I'm going to do kind of a quick summary of the takeaways from some of this research and then turn our attention to this vital resilient communities question that I wanted to wrap up with. And so I think the key takeaways from this roughly a decade of research coming out of UVM in partnership with our state and regional funders is that road erosion, road surface, road ditch, and outlet erosion is a substantial source of sediment and phosphorus production. And important to consider when we're thinking about water quality and receiving waters, and that this production of pollutants increases with road length, with slope steepness and road gradient, and with rainfall amounts that we're seeing at these sites. So important for the climate picture of the future. But another important takeaway from this research is that the use of these erosion control measures really does reduce pollutant production if they persist over time, and they persist when they're exposed to extreme floods. So a good sort of success story in the state, I think. Question, I think, in the context of the Vermont Climate Action Plan should really go beyond this kind of phosphorus tracking, water quality tracking question to ask, how do we think about community vitality, community resiliency, and even community economic sustainability in light of these findings? And so I just want to wrap up by showing you a little bit of work that's getting a little dated now, but might answer this question. This was work that Joanne Garten, who's now with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec, did as part of her master's project, where she went into 5 communities and looked at their budgets with the road crew, the road foreman, and the town administrator. So these are the 5 communities and a few statistics on them. She just looked at a single year's budget with them and asked them through a series of questions some things about how did they apportion out their budget in terms of salaries, and I'll show you materials in a minute, to winter and non-winter work, and to work on the paved portion and the unpaved portion of their road network. And these numbers that I've highlighted here in red are the salary costs that each town told her they attributed based on their budgets to unpaved road non-winter work. And we sort of assumed that this would be work that was addressing this rainy season erosion related activity. And then here's sort of what we got out of the budgets for non-winter material costs across these 2 towns, or sorry, these 5 towns also. So if you add the salary and material cost together, you get values that are shown on this graph for this one budget year of each town. And then we're color coding this based on answers that the road foreman and town administrator gave us, mainly the road foreman, on how they apportioned their time to routine maintenance work, repairing and fixing what we called problem roads, and constructing and maintaining BMPs. And I'm quite sure that the story has changed quite a bit since 2014. But at this time, here's what you're seeing across these towns, like this amount of cost essentially for that one budget year in the routine work, this kind of cost in the fixing in response to storm events, and this kind of level of financial investment into constructing and maintaining BMPs. And then the last little piece of work on this, and I'm almost about to wrap up, use this tool that Stone Environmental had created that ranked roads across the towns of Vermont with respect to low, moderate, and high risk of erosion. So it gave us an estimate for each town of the erosion risk. And we just used that to get the mileage for those 5 towns that we had talked to of how much road length was, say, in high and medium priority for erosion risk. And we applied that $4,000 per 100 feet of road length cost that we had gotten out of that earlier study to try and come up with an estimate, and then divided that cost estimate by 8 years based on the longevity of BMPs to say, hey, if you were going to treat these high erosion priority roads with erosion control practices, what might it cost you across these towns? So these numbers here, an estimate based on 2013-14 numbers of the cost of treating high priority roads with erosion control treatments. And if you compare that to the numbers that the towns told us that they were spending on fixing problem roads, what you see is that the repair and fixing problem road cost is about the cost of what it might take to sort of shift from a reactive stance to a proactive stance towards more BMP construction. And I think we're seeing that across the state now in the almost 10 years since we completed this work, and seeing a lot of successes in the outcomes of that. Okay, so I'll just circle back to the Vermont Climate Action Plan and wrapping up here and say that I think some of this research tells us that if we do, in a wetter future in Vermont, want to protect and build vital communities and protect our infrastructure, that addressing this problem of increasing erosion on roads and storm damage is a really important issue to address. And I know a lot of you who are attending this lecture today are involved in that on-the-ground work. There may also be some opportunities to frame what we're doing and actually take credit for what you all are doing out there as building resilient working lands. We know our transportation network is absolutely critical to our economy and to our landscape and our livelihood. And so the work that you all are doing to implement these practices are really creating a more resilient state for us. And then maybe there are also some connections between investing in workforce development, building the capacity at the town level to do this work, to understand why you'd want to address water quality impacts and storm resilience impacts, and even to bring up a workforce at the town or at the county level that can apply for the availability of these funds. So if any of you are interested in learning a little bit more about the research, I've put in this last slide links to some of the reports and published work. Mary's going to post this, so you'd be able to just click on a link if you're interested in seeing the reports. And I put my email address down here at the bottom, and happy to have any of you contact me at UVM if you're interested in asking other questions. And I'm sorry I don't have talked too long. We're getting close to the end, but I'm happy to field questions from any of you. Mary, maybe I should defer to you on how to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly. That was really wonderful. We have a couple questions. Before I want to just plug, we have a feedback form. It would be great if everyone could fill that out before they leave. I've put it in the chat. Our first question is about the hotspot analysis. Has that work been done in other basins, to your knowledge?
It hasn't, to my knowledge, but it wouldn't be very hard to just take our numbers, and do the back of the envelope kind of calculation, because it's all based on those statistical models of road grade and volume of features. So it would be really easy for someone to do that. And if whoever asked that is interested in pursuing that, like, I'd be happy to both talk you through it and even consider having students at UVM do this kinds of calculations for you in the future. I'm always looking for good GIS projects for students.
We had another question. There's useful LiDAR analysis that can help identify erosion using variations using topographic openness, maybe better than visually searching. Has this type of analysis been explored?
That's a great question. A couple of things I know about. The UVM Spatial Analysis Lab has been doing some work. I don't have this entirely on the top of my head, but doing some work on this headwaters effort to identify roads that you can only see with LiDAR through the forest canopy, and trying to get a sense of where the roads are. And there's been some discussion out of that effort and trying to use that LiDAR also to identify, so this would be airborne LiDAR, to identify erosional features. That's the only thing I can think of. There's definitely discussions in the kind of geospatial community about making use of LiDAR technology. Jarlath O'Neill Dunn's very much on top of this kind of thing. Has done a lot of work with LiDAR and drone work and big flood impacted sites. Yeah, if whoever that was that put in that question wants to get in touch with me later, it'd be fun to talk about that too.
Yeah, those slides will be posted on our website, which I've put in the chat. So if anyone wants to contact Beverly, they'll be there. I see we're at time. We have a couple more questions. If Would you like to stay on and answer them, Beverly?
I'm
Or
happy to, and I won't be offended if people got to get back to work and need to hang up. So
yeah.
please feel free. Yeah, I'm happy to stay on.
Okay, we have a couple more. The rate of change for gullies is interesting. Any thoughts in support of or in caution against using that rate of change as one factor in prioritizing gully restoration and clean water / stormwater project investment around those more rapidly deteriorating gullies? It's kind of a long question.
Yeah.
Gianna, if you want to unmute and
Yeah, I'm happy to have that person just bat it back and forth too.
Sure. Yeah, I guess thank you so much for your talk, Beverly. It's
Yeah.
really interesting. And I just wonder, sometimes projects might be prioritized by the size of them or the current phosphorus loading, but this idea of rate of change and vulnerability is interesting and a really great way to sort of bake in vulnerability and resilience in prioritizing where investments are made. And I just wondered if you had comments on that or things to consider if folks wanted to integrate that information into a prioritization scheme.
Yeah, it's a great question. The COVID impacts on that project were really challenging. And we spent a lot of time towards the end of it with with VTrans and the technical advisory committee on that project, talking about how do we take these results and sort of move them into management and implementation. And that was kind of my big takeaway is the change rate is probably the most important thing to think about. Because gullies do eventually stabilize. And some of the biggest gullies, like I went out with some of the people on the road crew in Duxbury one day to this gigantic gully in Duxbury. And the person I was with, I think it was either the road foreman or another person on the road crew, said, yeah, to get in here and fix this thing, we'd have to cut down trees and bring in a lot of heavy equipment. So some of those really big ones, the amount of sort of impact that you'd have to get at them kind of begs the question of, do you really want to go there to address them? But the rate of change issue, like where we see them growing quickly, is something to be thinking about, and maybe even to be thinking adaptively on how can we be monitoring this so we know where they are actually changing. There's some simple ways to do that, simple like erosion pins that you could put out. You don't need a researcher to do, just simple monitoring crew could do that kind of work. Thanks for the question. It's a good one.
we just have two other questions. One is, did the operating costs of road maintenance include the cost of capital?
Right, for those 5 towns in the Mad River Valley. Trying to think, it's been so long ago now. Like I know things came up like they bought a new dump truck or they bought a new grader. I'm assuming that's what the person means by capital. Feel free to turn on your mic and camera if you want to ask more. I think not. I think we were looking at a single year budget. I mean, we were looking at a single year budget. I think that budget, if it included an expenditure in that year of a major capital expense, I think that came out first because we were using that one year's budget as kind of a typical set of practices. Does that answer the question from the person who asked?
Yeah, Martha, are you still here? Oh, I see.
It's a good question because it ignores the fact that in addition to salaries and materials, there are these major capital expenditures that have to happen to have the equipment there to do the work.
Yeah, Martha just wrote yes, thank you in the chat. And our last question from Karen Bates is, how important is the removal of sediment from the plunge pool or ditches in phosphorus reduction you calculated?
Good question, Karen. Hi. We didn't study that. I would say, that you do probably want to be aware that just like in any situation where you've got a massive material that then you can liberate, that sediment-bound phosphorus is going to evolve over time. You may have a source there, but I think you have to balance that with the workload of what it would take to do the on-the-ground work to go and evacuate that material. I was just talking to someone, couple of days ago about the amount of work that road crews are doing, actually scraping stone. Oh, it's a person that lives in Huntington. The amount of work that road crews are doing, scraping stone out of ditches and taking it back to the garage to clean it out and put it back, or in some cases, putting in clean stone because of the expense of doing the washing. And I think we got to get to the point where we balance like the counting every pound of phosphorus to the let's be smart about trying to control erosion and know that in the end, building flood resilience is going to buy us a lot in the end. That's maybe, we could talk about it more, Karen, if you want.
Yeah, I think it's an important point because we do get project proposals on dirt roads, or at least country roads, that have look for detention ponds, bioinfiltration, or even dry wells. And the question is, yeah, you can calculate phosphorus reduction because of the sediment that was removed, but is it practical to think that it's going to get removed in a timely manner so that we can actually show the phosphorus is taken out
of the picture forever? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do we want to go to Todd's question before we stop?
Yeah, if you have time.
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I won't be offended if anyone needs to just hang up.
Karen, go to your question from my UVM research on the Winooski River. Phosphorus is adsorbed to the outside of clay particles because they're so tiny. They're colloidal. You can't feel them. You got to use a microscope to see them. Silts and sands, the other two mineral fractions, are so big that they don't have the electrical charge on the outside. So there's one piece of it. The other piece, again, because clay soils are so small, the Brownian motion, they don't settle out. So on a plunge pool outlet of a culvert that's full of sands and clay, that's not going to have clays. The clays are going to be washed into Lake Champlain. If it's going to be mostly sediments because the silts are, they take quiet water. Silts are platy and they float down in very quiet waters. They do the falling leaf effect. So I don't know that that's going to be much of a phosphorus reduction benefit. And then the cost benefit analysis is probably going to be even less than that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, maybe the bigger thing for us all to be thinking about is we're not going to be able to get away from the phosphorus tracking to meet the TMDL requirements. But the numbers always have kind of biggish uncertainty bounds around them. And to the extent that we can move the thinking strictly away from phosphorus counting and more towards building resilience of every kind. And I think even though the research that I've been involved in was motivated by clean water imperatives, I think it has a lot to say about just storm-proofing our landscape and our road network and building communities that aren't throwing a lot of their economic resources into fixing these problems. So it may be and I'm sort of trying to go at right angles to what you're asking, Karen, because we won't be able to get away from the phosphorus tracking, but we do want to move beyond it to thinking about practices that help us build resilience and help us be ready for the next big storm, regardless of whether we're going to buy that incremental phosphorus reduction that we need.
Thank you so much, Beverly. I know this is a busy time with finals and everything, so I really appreciate your time. That was wonderful. Beverly has provided her email, so I put it in the chat if you have more questions and want to reach out. Thank you all for coming, and that's all.
Thanks. I just saw that Rob Moore put a chat in there, and Rob was a participant in some of this study, so should acknowledge him. Thanks for the invitation, and happy to connect with any of you all by email or phone calls later. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Have a good